In my life, I've been called many names. My favorite is Tombstone.
With Spider-Man Brand New Day already in theatres, Spider-Noir having already dropped its version back in May, and your friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man about to take its own take into Season 2 this fall, I did not expect one Spider-Man villain to suddenly dominate three completely different projects at once. All three have their own take on the same man, and most of you probably know him as the towering, bulletproof gangster who's almost impossible to put down. But Lonnie Lincoln's real story is a lot sadder and stranger than that. So, without further ado, let's dissect the bulletproof anatomy of Tombstone.
I'm gonna prepare a coffin for you, a real flat one, brother.
Who was Lonnie Lincoln before he became a monster? In order to really understand Tombstone and his powers, we have to go back to his origin. Lonnie Lincoln was born in Harlem with albinism, meaning he had little or no pigment in his skin, and even his hair was pale white. On top of that, he also had a raspy voice that made him stand out even more. As a kid, that made him a target. The other kids constantly mocked him and treated him like an outsider, and years of bullying and rejection slowly taught Lonnie that if the world already saw him as a monster, he might as well become one. As he got older, he grew stronger and far more intimidating than the people who used to torment him, and so he began extorting money from his classmates just to survive socially in a world that had already decided what he was. That path eventually pulled him deeper into Harlem's criminal underworld. However, there was one person who never treated him like a freak, and that was a classmate named Robbie Robertson, who never mocked him and instead treated him like a person. Lonnie latched onto that so hard that I think he mistook basic decency for real friendship, and that, to me, is the emotional engine of this character. Their lives eventually took very different paths, as Lonnie became one of New York's most feared crime bosses, while Robbie grew up to become a respected journalist at the Daily Bugle. If anything, it got more complicated because Robbie ended up investigating the very criminal empire Lonnie had disappeared into.
Just listen, and I'll teach you the facts of life.
How did an ordinary mob enforcer become nearly unkillable? Now see, Lincoln was not born powerful, nor was he chosen for anything, which actually separates Tombstone from almost every other tough guy in Spider-Man's rogues gallery. He became a mob enforcer first, and built his reputation purely through his brutality. At this point, he did not have a single superhuman ability to his name, yet the underworld already feared him for what he could do with his bare hands. His transformation happened while Robbie Robertson was investigating Lincoln's criminal activities, leading to Lincoln's exposure to an experimental chemical compound known as Diox-3. This compound altered Lincoln's body and made his skin far denser and tougher, while pushing his strength and reflexes into superhuman territory. And you see, his transformation happened inside the exact same criminal world he already lived in. He was not bitten by anything special or caught up in some noble lab accident. His powers were just another part of the life he had already chosen, and they made him even harder to stop.
Rest in pieces.
What can Tombstone's body actually do beyond being hard to hurt? Stopping at "he's tough" is honestly underselling him. After Diox-3, Tombstone can now lift around 6 tons, which puts him well above most street-level fighters Spider-Man deals with on a regular basis. His stamina is also enhanced, allowing him to keep fighting for long stretches without slowing down. His skin can shrug off most conventional gunfire, and he is highly resistant to extreme heat, cold, and even electricity. Even before Diox-3, Lincoln leaned into the vampire aesthetic on purpose, filing his own teeth and nails into sharp points specifically to make himself look more monstrous and intimidating. Even his style of fighting carries that brutality, relying heavily on close quarter attacks and strangulation, which fits someone who spent his whole life being underestimated. His albinism cuts both ways though, which Adaptations kind of skip. In the comics, being albino actually leaves him with weaker eyesight and real sensitivity to sunlight, giving him vulnerabilities despite all his physical advantages. He even had damaged vocal cords before his transformation, which gave him a trademark whisper, but after his exposure to Diox-3, that became far less defining, with many modern versions of him speaking in a much deeper and more commanding voice. What is Tombstone's greatest feat of power in the comics? I've seen a lot of tier list nonsense thrown around online, so I went back to what's actually been shown on the page and found that his best moments are about how he survives. The one I'm especially fond of is when the Punisher captured Tombstone, chained him to a wrecking ball, and then dumped him straight into a river. We all know Frank Castle does not do half measures, and yet Tombstone came back from it. That single act of survival says more about his character than any strength stat ever could, proving that as long as Tombstone is still breathing, he's still dangerous. His history with the Punisher runs much deeper than that moment too. Frank has gone after Tombstone again and again over the years, yet Tombstone has survived more than one attempt on his life. And when Daredevil and the Punisher teamed up against him directly, it only reinforced just how much punishment he can absorb before going down. So, this is a character who keeps surviving encounters with some of Marvel's deadliest vigilantes. His time in the Sinister 12 is worth mentioning too, though it's more proof of his standing than a showcase of his power. When Green Goblin assembled a team to wage war on Spider-Man and his allies, Tombstone was one of the villains chosen alongside Vulture, Electro, Sandman, and Venom. That kind of company speaks for itself, even if he does not have one big signature win to point to here. And then there's a recent development that's still unfolding. In a new Punisher storyline, Tombstone becomes the target of a blackmail scheme involving Jigsaw posing as his lawyer. I wanted to include this because it shows what we mean by his greatest feat, and shows that even while he's behind bars, other major players are trying to seize control of his empire. That's not a move anyone makes unless both the man and the empire still command real power and respect. How does his friendship with Robbie Robertson actually work? Their relationship is so much messier than just two childhood friends who ended up on opposite sides, and it forms the emotional core of Tombstone's entire character. Even as teenagers, Lonnie had a strange attachment to Robbie, and intimidated him constantly, even though Robbie was one of the only people who ever treated him like an actual human being. Things started getting messier between them when Robbie witnessed Lonnie murder a man, and Lonnie threatened him into staying silent. That decision haunted Robbie for over 20 years, while he built his career as a reporter at the Daily Bugle. Eventually, Robbie decided to tell the truth, even if it meant admitting he had hidden evidence for decades. And that choice sent both men to prison. But Tombstone only wanted revenge and escaped, taking Robbie with him. He soon hunted Robbie down again, refusing to let go of his grudge. Even after everything they had done to each other, their lives never really stopped overlapping. Ironically, their final confrontation ended up changing everything when Tombstone was exposed to Diox 3. Instead of blaming Robbie for what happened, Lonnie actually saw those powers as a gift. In his mind, Robbie had unknowingly given him exactly what he always wanted, and because of that, he finally let go of the grudge that had consumed him for decades. And then the comics take their relationship in a direction I never would have expected. Tombstone's daughter, Janice Lincoln, ends up falling in love with Robbie's son, Randy Robertson. Suddenly, two men who had spent decades trying to destroy each other are connected through their children. I think it's such an interesting way for a rivalry to evolve. Plus, you don't really see that happen very often in superhero comics. The hatred never completely disappears, but neither does the history they share. How did Tombstone rise through New York's criminal underworld? Lonnie's rise started long before he ever became superhuman, and his climb is much more interesting than just a big, scary guy getting promoted. He dropped out of school, sharpened his image by filing his teeth into points, trained himself in hand-to-hand combat, and built a notorious reputation. He started out as a street enforcer before becoming a professional hitman, and somehow witnesses against him either disappeared or were too terrified to testify. Before building his own empire, Tombstone served as one of the Kingpin's most trusted enforcers, and carved out a place for himself in New York's criminal underworld. He crossed paths with crime bosses like Hammerhead, Silvermane, the Owl, and Madame Mask, sometimes working with them and other times fighting them for territory. And when Wilson Fisk's grip on New York finally started to slip, Tombstone did not waste a second making his move. He wanted to become the city's next kingpin. However, his relationship with his daughter really surprised me, because even though he kept her existence a secret for years, he always made sure she was taken care of. He even paid for her to attend law school, hoping she would learn how to use the legal system to benefit the family instead of becoming a costume supervillain. That's the funny contradiction with Tombstone. He had no problem teaching Janice how to scam people or steal when she was growing up, but the one thing he didn't want was for her to put on a costume and follow in his footsteps. Ironically, Janice admired her father so much that she became the supervillain Beetle anyway. At times, the two even found themselves fighting on the same side, but just as often, they clashed over how New York's criminal underworld should be run. But as much as Tombstone tried to keep his personal life separate from his criminal life, they eventually did collide. Even his daughter's wedding to Randy Robertson wasn't free from violence, as an assassin attacked the ceremony, proving that the criminal underworld was never something Tombstone could truly leave behind. Is Tombstone actually invincible? It's really easy to look at Tombstone and think he's basically impossible to kill, but the comics make it pretty clear that that isn't actually the case. I mean, his powers are very real, and he does have superhuman strength and enhanced durability, but he's not literally invincible. He's just built to take an incredible amount of punishment, but that does not mean that he's immune to it. He seems more dangerous because of his reputation than just his abilities. Others stop testing him, assuming he's impossible to hurt, and that fear ends up working in his favour. Tombstone almost always survives, even when someone does manage to seriously injure him. So, you could say that there really isn't a single obvious weakness. His biggest vulnerability has been the very criminal world he chose to be part of. Rival crime bosses and power struggles have put him in danger far more often than any superhero has. That's better for his character than giving him some obvious Achilles heel. How does Tombstone's rivalry with Spider-Man differ from most villains? I feel Tombstone has a very different relationship with superheroes than most Spider-Man villains do. Characters like Green Goblin or Dr. Octopus become obsessed with Spider-Man, and their entire lives eventually start revolving around Peter Parker. But to Tombstone, Spider-Man is just another obstacle, getting in the way of business. Tombstone never tries to expose Peter's identity or make his life miserable whenever Spider-Man interferes with one of his operations. That's a huge difference right there. During his gang war with the Rose, Tombstone tricks Spider-Man into doing his dirty work by making him unknowingly take out the Rose's men instead of plotting revenge against him. Even though he has joined teams like the Sinister 12 and Dr. Octopus's villain group to fight Spider-Man, he's never really been the mastermind behind those plans. And the same thing carries over to Daredevil. They have fought each other plenty of times, and Daredevil's even needed help from heroes like the Punisher to bring Tombstone down, but their rivalry has never been as deeply personal as Daredevil's feud with Kingpin. How do adaptations portray Tombstone differently from the comics? I've noticed that almost every adaptation changes one of the most important parts of his character, which is his ambition. For example, take the Spectacular Spider-Man, where he is known as the Big Man. He is a calm and calculating crime boss who hides behind the image of a wealthy businessman and philanthropist. Even though the show never really explains his powers, he's still portrayed as physically overwhelming and casually overpowering Spider-Man, thus showing hints of the same superhuman strength and durability he's known for in the comics. It works really well for the show, especially since the writers could not use Kingpin, but it also means Tombstone ends up filling someone else's role rather than his own. Then there's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, where he is turned into Kingpin's personal bodyguard and the head of security for Fisk Industries. He's still intimidating and tough, and is always the first person Fisk relies on when things get physical, but he's no longer running his own criminal empire. He's the muscle instead of the mastermind. So almost every version of Tombstone either makes him bigger by giving him someone else's role, or smaller by making him work for someone else, and very few adaptations actually let him be the ambitious crime lord he is in the comics. That's why this year is especially different, because not only are we getting 3 different versions of Tombstone, but all of them are actually exploring him instead of just using him to support another villain's story. Why does 2026 feel like the year of Tombstone? I can't remember the last time one Spider-Man villain showed up in 3 completely different projects all in the same year. And somehow, 2026 has become the year of Tombstone. First, there is Spider-Man Brand New Day, which has just been released, where I was hoping Lonnie Lincoln would have a much bigger role, because he really only shows up in a brief cameo in the opening montage, where he is shown holding Spider-Man over the edge of a building before the two exchange a few quips, and Spidey quickly takes him down. They may be setting Tombstone up for a much bigger role in future Spider-Man films, but you know what? Tombstone is played by Marvin Jones III, the same actor who voiced him in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I love how they kept the same actor across animation and live action, which makes this version of Tombstone more special than just another quick villain cameo. Then we have Spider-Noir, which goes in a completely different direction with the character. Instead of sticking to his comic book origin, this version imagines Lonnie Lincoln as a former prisoner of war who was experimented on by German scientists, which left him with his signature bulletproof skin. He ends up working for Silvermane, but after being cured with help from Robbie Robertson, he finally walks away from that life. It's a totally different take on Tombstone, but it still keeps the core idea of a physically imposing man whose body's been transformed into something almost impossible to hurt. It's crazy how his backstory can be completely reinvented, and yet he stays the Tombstone we know. And then later this year, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man returns with Season 2, bringing yet another version of Lonnie Lincoln. Now here, we don't get introduced to this terrifying crime boss we are all used to. Instead, it starts with Lonnie as Peter Parker's classmate, and he is smart and a talented football captain who's genuinely trying to build a better life for himself despite growing up in a rough neighborhood. However, he gets pulled into gang life little by little while trying to protect his brother, and by the end of the first season, he has fully embraced the name Tombstone. I feel it's a more tragic take on the character because we actually get to watch the good person disappear before the villain takes over. It's crazy that he's the one showing up everywhere because he's never been Spider-Man's biggest or most iconic villain, like the Green Goblin or Dr. Octopus. It could be because he fits so well into almost any version of Spider-Man's world, whether it is a grounded crime story, a noir detective series, or an animated coming-of-age show. To me, he has always been an underrated villain, and has one of the most tragic backstories among all the other villains of Spider-Man. Hopefully, after this year, a lot more of you will start seeing him that way too. And that was the Bulletproof anatomy of Tombstone. Hopefully this video gave you a whole new appreciation for a villain who's often overshadowed by other iconic villains, because I feel that Lonnie Lincoln has one of the most tragic and fascinating stories in Spider-Man's rogues gallery. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. See you!